Welcome to part 6 and the final part of this Blender tutorial series where we're creating this product visualization in Blender, and throughout the tutorial series we're creating this studio microphone. So this is the final part, and so in this part we're going to be doing the animation, the rendering, and the video editing. And if you've been enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support me and this channel, a great way to do that is by purchasing the finished project files. You can get that with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. Now we are going to be rendering out the animation in this part, and if your computer's a little bit slow and doesn't render quite fast, you might be considering using some sort of render farm service. And so I wanted to let you know about a really great render farm service for Blender. Blender Grid is an easy to use render farm specifically designed for Blender. I've used the service and I highly recommend it. Upload your Blender file or a zip file with the blend file and textures. You can change the render settings on the website before rendering. Blender Grid will let you know the cost before you start the render. You can even choose when you want the render to finish if you're on a tight deadline. While it renders, you can check the rendered frames to make sure everything is rendering properly. Once it finishes, just download the files and compile the frames in a video editor. Use the link in the description to get $20 of render credit on your first render. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial series, I'm going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because I'm going for realism. You could use Eevee if you want to, it does look pretty good in Eevee, but I'm going to be using Cycles for more realism. Now, we already added a camera, but one thing that I want to do to the camera is select the camera, and I'm going to go to the object data properties of the camera, and I'm going to turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom the camera in a bit, and it makes everything look a bit more flat, and I just like how that looks a little bit nicer, and I think, move the camera out just a bit now. Now before we do the animation, I do want to do just a little bit of rigging. We need to kind of rig some of the objects before we animate it. So we're just going to do some very simple rigging. So one thing that I want to do is parent all the chord objects to one object. So I'm just going to center the 3D cursor, and I'm going to go to empty, and I'm just going to add a sphere empty. We'll just zoom into the sphere, and I'm going to scale it down, and I'm going to bring it right down here so it's just along the chord, so it's on top of the chord. Then I'll hold down the shift key and select all the objects, and last I'll shift select the empty, and I'm going to hit Control P, and I'm going to set parent to object keep transform. So now when I move this object around, you can see the chord is going to move with it, so that'll be really helpful for the rigging. So now that we've finished rigging that piece, I'm just going to go here to the chord and just hide the chord object. And so I'm actually going to hide the other ones, so let's hide the arm mount and the shock mount. And let's also hide the lights and camera. So now I want to parent all of these objects to another empty. So I'll just go to the add menu. We're just going to add a empty sphere, and I'll just scale it down, and I'll just stick it here kind of in the middle. And then I'll select all the objects and make sure this is selected last. Control P, object keep transform. So now I can move this and the other objects move with it. Also this empty, let's just drag it here and put it into the microphone. And I can just rename this to microphone controller. Also, I do want to unhide all the objects because I want to make sure that this one here is inside the chord. So select this object, we'll hit M, we'll move it to chord, and then we'll rename it. So hit F2, and I can call it chord controller. So we can now hide the microphone and we can hide the chord. And I now want to parent all of these objects, and they're going to be eventually parented all over to the arm here. So let's hit Shift C to center the 3D cursor. Let's go to empty, and I'm going to add another sphere just because I like these. They're pretty easy to use and pretty easy to see. So I'm going to scale them down and move this over here. And I'm just going to stick this right here. And this is going to be controlling the entire arm. So let's rename this. So I can call this arm controller. And then I can take the arm controller and I can put it here into the arm mount. So let's just hide the lights and camera, just hide that. And of course, if you wanted to, you could kind of rig this so that if you like rotate this up, you could, for example, parent all of these objects to this object. So then when you rotate it, you can rotate the arm up. What I'm going to do is just select all of these objects. And then lastly, shift select this object here. So I'll hit Control P, set parent to object, keep transform. So now if I rotate this, everything is going to move along with it because that's all we're going to be animating in the product animation. So let's just unhide everything in the outliner so we can see everything again. So we're going to have this object kind of move in and rotate up into the scene. Then we're also going to have the microphone kind of moving down, and we're also going to have this object here kind of moving on top of the microphone, and we're also going to have the chord come up to the scene. So right now everything is pretty much placed how I want it to be at the end of the animation. But first I'm just going to move this empty right up here, and I'm just going to plug this here in just like that. So everything is pretty much how it's going to be. So I'm basically going to animate it backwards. So I'm first going to add keyframes where the objects are, and then I'm going to go back to the starting of the timeline and then animate the moving backwards. So what I'm first going to do is go to frame 40. And at frame 40, I'll go to front view, and this is where I want the arm to be. So I'll select the empty, and I'm going to hit K, and I'll just insert location, rotation, scale. Now I'm going to go all the way back to frame 0, and then I can kind of rotate this down, and I can move it back a bit. I'll just rotate down a bit more and move it a bit farther back, and then hit K, and we'll add location, rotation, scale. So now you can see the arm just moves up. Let's go into the camera view and see how that's looking. So the arm just kind of moves up, and maybe I'll move the camera out a little bit and move it up a little bit, just so I can see it a little bit better. So there's the first animation, pretty easy to do. Now for the second part of the animation, I'm going to have the microphone moving down here and just going inside the shock mount. So because the microphone is already set up where I want it, I'm going to go to frame 80. And then on frame 80, I'll hit K and just add location, rotation, scale. Then what I'm going to do is go back here to frame 30, and I'm going to move the microphone up on the Z-axis and just stick it about here, hit K, location, rotation, scale. So now when I play this, this moves up, and then the microphone just moves down and it just plugs right in there. So now what I want to do is animate the plug, so we'll select the plug, and I'm going to go to frame 100, and I'll hit K and add location, rotation, scale. So now I can go back, and I'm going to go back to frame 50, and I'll go to front view, and I'm going to rotate this and kind of move it right down here, just like that. And I'll hit K, location, rotation, scale. So now when I play this, you can see the plug just comes up and sticks in there. Now, it just looks a little bit weird how it's kind of sliding sideways. So I want to make it so it kind of comes up here and then goes straight in. So what I'm going to do is go to frame 85. Let's go to 85 right there. And I want to rotate this, kind of rotate it straight. I can also hit Alt-R just to clear the rotation. So Alt-R. Bring it right over here and stick it pretty close, and then hit K and add location, rotation, scale. So this way it'll come up and then it'll be straight. So then right at the very end, you can see it just slides in. So that just looks a little bit more crisp and nice because it comes up and then right here it just slides up perfectly straight. Now finally, I want to animate this object. Now this object is parented to the other object. So if I just select the object, I'll hit Alt-P. We're going to clear parent and keep the transform because I want to keep it where it is. And I'm now going to go over to frame 130, and I'll hit K, add location, rotation, scale. And then I'm going to go back over to frame 90, and I will just bring it up on the Z-axis to about there, hit K, and add location, rotation, scale. So now if we play this, that just drops down. So we can go back to the starting and play the entire thing. So it kind of comes up, this comes down, that plugs in, and then finally the last one goes in, just like that. So the rest of the animation is just going to be animating the camera. We've already animated all the objects, so we're just going to kind of animate the camera moving around and looking at the object. Before I animate the cameras though, I want to add a focus to the camera, and that way when I duplicate the cameras to make different camera angles, they're all going to use the same focus. So I'm just going to place my 3D cursor here, and then I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to add another sphere, and we're just going to scale the sphere empty way down. And I'm using sphere objects because they don't show up in the render, so I can just use them just for objects if I just need to place an object somewhere. So I'm going to stick the empty right there kind of on the surface of the microphone, maybe bring it down a bit. And then if I click here on the corner to select the camera, let's go to the camera settings, and I'll turn on the depth of field, and we're just going to choose the empty. And then here on the f-stop, I think turning it to 3 is pretty good for the f-stop. If we go into the rendered view, I kind of want there to be a bit of a blur because it is kind of a smaller object, and I think the blur looks kind of nice, but I definitely don't want to make it too blurry. So I think 3 is pretty good. Now because the objects are moving, I also want to move this object here, and I want to move along with the objects. So let's go to frame 80, and that's where this microphone is right here. So we'll hit K and add location, rotation, scale so that the focus object has a keyframe. We're now going to go back here, and let's just go to maybe frame 40, and I'll bring it down so the focus is more right here in the center of where the mount is. And actually let's select this, and we're going to move it forward because we might as well focus it on kind of the center there, or the front. So we'll hit K, location, rotation, scale, so it's there on the front of the mount. Now we can move it following the mount. So if we go back to 0, let's just drag it over here kind of in the center there of the mount, bring it back like that, and then hit K, location, rotation, scale. So now if this comes up, you can see that it's following the mount. So if we go into the rendered viewport mode to see what it's looking like, you can see the focus follows the mount, and then the focus comes up here, when this is coming down. So that way it focuses on the main objects. So now let's animate the camera. So I'm going to go back here to frame 0 and I'm going to select the camera and I'm going to move it over to this side a bit, and we'll also rotate it on the Z-axis slightly over like that. And then we can hit K and add location, rotation, scale. And now we're going to go over here and we're going to go to frame 170. At 170, we're going to switch the camera angle. So I'm going to move this over. Let's move it over on the X-axis. And I can also rotate that over a little bit and move it over on the X-axis just like that. We'll hit K and add location, rotation, scale. So now if I just play this, the camera is slowly moving. However, I'm going to select all the keyframes in the timeline, and with them selected, I'll hit T, and we're going to use the linear interpolation. So hit T and choose linear. This way, when I play this, the camera is just moving very slowly, but the speed is going to be consistent. Now, I think it could be moving a bit faster, so I'm going to go to frame 170 and kind of move it a bit farther, and then kind of move it over, and then I'll hit K and use location, rotation, scale, and that's going to override the keyframe. So now if I play this, you can see it's just a little bit faster. So there we go, that is the first camera animation. So for the end frame, I'm going to set it to 450. So let's set the end frame to 450. That's going to be the total length of the animation. So now here at frame 170, I want to make it a different camera. So let's go out here and I'll just hit Shift D to duplicate, drop it here. And then if we go back one frame to 169, I'm going to select this camera, which is the active camera, and I'm going to hover my mouse here on the timeline, and I'll press Control B. That is going to add this marker here and bind that camera to the marker. So we'll go one frame over. We're going to select the other camera, select the camera which isn't the active camera. You can see the triangle is clear. And what we're going to do is again hover our mouse here on the timeline and press Control B. So now you can see it's the active camera and we added another marker there. So now if I go here into the camera view and kind of play this, you can see at frame 170 it switches to the other camera. Now the camera still has the same keyframes, so if we select the second camera, let's hit the A key in the timeline and hit X to delete and delete the keyframes. So now when I play this, you can see when it gets to frame 170, it switches to the other camera. So I can now rotate the camera and I can move it around. I'm going to move it here, kind of bring it in towards the object. Let's rotate it so it is straight like that. Just bring it pretty close. And then I'll bring it down here and bring it back a little bit. So for the second camera, we're just going to have it animating upwards. So let's bring this out, kind of move it right there. And then we'll just animate it upwards like that. So once we've placed the camera to where we want, we're going to go to frame 170. And again, let's just bring it up here and then we'll hit K, add location, rotation, scale, and then we'll just play the animation. And I'm going to bring this over to frame 290. So I can just type in 290 there on the current frame. And then I'm going to hit G to grab. We'll bring this up on the Z axis. I'm just going to stick it here, kind of towards the top, and then K, add keyframes there. So now when I play this, the camera moves up. Now I need to select everything in the timeline, select all the keyframes, and we'll use T, and again, we're going to use the linear. So now when I play this, you can see it's moving at a consistent speed. And then if it's moving too fast, you can also just hit the S key to kind of scale it. You can scale the keyframes out, and so if they're farther away from each other, the animation's going to play a little bit slower. So let's go to frame 290 again, right there, 290, and we're going to duplicate the camera and then add one more. So we'll duplicate the camera, drop it here. We'll select all the keyframes with the A key and we'll hit X and delete keyframes because we don't want to add the keyframes for the new camera. And then with the new camera selected, we'll hover our mouse in the timeline and hit Control B. So now when I play this, you can see we're using that camera and then it switches to the last camera. So for the last camera, I'm going to make it kind of rotating kind of in a circular motion like this. So let's go into the camera view. We can move it down. Let's bring it out and we'll rotate it sideways. Rotate it sideways, and we're going to have it kind of start over on this angle, and it's going to rotate around the microphone. So we're going to add a very basic rigging setup to rotate it around the microphone. So let's center the 3D cursor. We're going to go to the add menu, and let's add an empty. We're going to add an empty circle, and I can rotate the empty. We'll rotate it by 90 degrees on the x-axis. Let's scale the circle down and kind of bring it up right here, just like that, so it's in the center. So it's getting a little bit complicated, so let's just select this camera here and hide it, and these lights we can also just hide them just to kind of get them out of the way. That's a bit better. So what I want to do is parent this camera to the circle empty. So we'll select the camera, select this last, we'll hit Control P, set parent to object, keep transform. And now if you select the circle and rotate the circle on the Z axis, you can see we have a really nice camera rig to just rotate it around. And you can also scale it and you can move it up and down. And so we're just going to be animating this object instead of the camera. So let's rotate that over. This is going to be at frame 290, and I'll hit K and add location rotation scale. We're now going to go to the very end, so the end is 450, and we'll rotate this on the Z axis over, all the way over, kind of to about there, and then K and add location rotation scale. And then again, select everything in the timeline, we'll hit T, and we're going to use the linear interpolation, so when I play this, it's going to be moving at a consistent speed. I'll hit Alt-H to unhide all the objects, and I'll go into the rendered view. We can just kind of see how that's looking in the viewport. So if you want to adjust the lighting, we can definitely do that. Now is a good time to adjust the lighting. So if you want to like move some of these lights around so that the rim lights look a bit nicer, you can do that. Maybe I'll rotate these lights a little bit farther back so the rim lights are a bit larger. Also, if we select the main light, we might want to make it a bit stronger. So I could make the power maybe like 180 instead. So it's a little bit brighter and you can kind of move it in a little bit. Just kind of play around with where it is. Something like that's pretty good. So what I now want to do is add a background. So we'll center the 3D cursor, we'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to add a plane. We'll bring the plane down, and we'll scale the plane up. And then if I go into edit mode, I want to scale the plane up on the x-axis, so it's nice and long. And maybe scale it up on the y a little bit. So I now want to go to the edge select, we can select this edge, and I can extrude the edge up so that it's nice and long. And then if we select this edge here, I'll use Control B, and I'll scroll my mouse wheel, just so that we can kind of add like a bevel there, and then we'll shade the object smooth. So this is just going to add a nice little backdrop to our animation. And so let's just play this and make sure that as this moves, the background is covering up everything the camera can see. Now I want to add a basic material to this because white just doesn't look good, it's too blown out. So let's go here to the materials, we'll add a new material, and I can just call it background. And for this background material, I'm going to make the base color fully black, and I'll turn the roughness up to like a 0.6. So now we just have a very basic kind of dark gray background. So now let's set up some render settings so it renders a bit faster. So here on the render properties, actually the output properties, I'm going to render this to 1920 by 1920 at 100%. Also, while we're here, let's set an output. So I'm going to save the images as PNG, and let's click on the file icon to set an output. And here in the project files, I'll click on this button to make a new folder. Let's call it frames 1. And inside the folder, we'll just click on the accept button so it'll render out all the frames to that folder. Also, if you want to, you can see that we added some other objects, but we didn't actually stick them into the correct collections. So if you click on this empty, this is going to be focus. So I'll call it focus empty. Let's put the focus empty in the lights and camera. This empty here is the camera rig. So I'll call this camera 3 rig because it's the third camera. So camera 3 rig, and I'll put this in lights and camera. And then the plane here, I'll double click on this and I'll rename this to background, and we'll put it here in lights and camera. All right, so let's continue with the render settings. So let's go over here to the render properties, and I'm actually not going to be using the denoise here in the render because I find that the denoise in the compositor actually works a lot better. If I turn on this denoise and render it, I find that kind of these blurred objects, they kind of look kind of grainy. You can kind of see what it looks like. So with the compositor denoise, it actually works quite a bit better. But here on the sampling, I'm going to turn the samples up to 200 so it's just a bit more smooth. Let's close the sampling, and I can open up the light paths because the light paths, if we turn the light paths down, it's going to render faster. So I can turn off the caustics, I can turn off the filter glossy, the indirect light, and then also here on the max bounces, I'm going to turn all of these off except the total, the diffuse, and the glossy. I'm going to turn all of those to 2 because if I turn these off, then you can see there's like some like reflection issues because it doesn't have as many light paths. So I'm just going to keep them to a small value of 2, but everything else can be turned to 0. Now another important thing is to turn on this motion blur because the motion blur is definitely going to make it look more realistic because when the objects are moving quite fast, there's going to be just a little bit of a blur. So let's go here to Blender's compositor. We'll click on use nodes, and I'm going to search for the denoise node. and we'll just drop the denoise here in between the two nodes, and we'll change the accurate to fast just because it doesn't really affect it too much, but it goes a lot faster. And then with the node wrangler enabled, you can Control Shift select the denoise. And that's going to add a viewer node, and so it'll render it out with the viewer and the composite. So we've set up the output, we've saved everything. Let's go back here to the layout. Now before I render the final animation, I did notice one small thing that I want to change. So if you select the main microphone and go back to the shading workspace and go here to this hue saturation value, I had the value turned out quite a bit higher to something like a 1.3 or something like that, but these fingerprints are much too visible, and that just doesn't look nice. So I'm going to turn this value instead to a 0.5, and that'll make the fingerprints a lot less visible. So I like that a lot better. So you can now just save the project, and we've already set everything up. So save the project, and then you can click on render and render the animation. So I've let the entire animation render out, but what I also want to do is create that first animation of the microphone kind of spinning. So what I'm going to do is open up the same file, but then I want to duplicate this file so it's separate. So I'll click on File, and I'll use Save As. And then for this file, I'm going to call it spinningmicrophone.blend and just save it in the same folder with my project files. So now this is a separate file, and so we can make the other animation of the microphone spinning. So I now just want to delete all the objects that I'm not going to be using, but I also want to delete all of the keyframes. So I'm going to move the timeline back to the starting here, and I'm just going to select everything, and then select everything here in the timeline, and we're just going to delete the keyframes. And what you can also do is select these markers here and just delete the markers, because we're not going to be switching the camera, we're just going to be using one camera. And now I just want to delete all the other objects that we're not going to use. So first let's click on the background and hit H to hide it, click on the light and hide that, and then hide this light, and then also hide this light. Now these two cameras here, we don't need these, so we can delete the cameras. We just want to keep this one camera, so we'll hide the camera, just hit H to hide that. And then these objects here, we don't need them, so if I just click and drag to select all of them, I'll just hit X and just delete that, so we don't need that. So we really just need this object here. I'll bring this down. We don't need this object here, so I'll delete that. That was used to rotate the camera. And also we don't need the foam cover because we're not going to be using that in the first animation, so we'll delete that as well. So we have this here, and then this one here, we also don't need that, so we'll delete that. So I'll hit Alt-H just to unhide the objects. So we have the background, the lights, the camera, and then we also have the microphone. So let's bring the microphone down kind of into the center of the scene. We can also move the camera, just kind of move the camera in and rotate it. And we're just going to place the camera so it's looking straight at the microphone. Let's go into the rendered view just to kind of see how that's looking. And then you can see the focus is messed up, so we're going to need to fix the focus. So to add the focus, let's just place the 3D cursor right here. Let's go to the add menu and we can just add an empty sphere, and I'll scale the empty sphere way down. And then if we just select the camera, go to the camera data properties, we just want to zoom in here and we'll use the eyedropper, and we're just going to select the new empty that we added. So we'll go into the rendered viewport mode just to see how that's looking, kind of zoom in a bit closer. And then also you can see the entire thing looks a bit dark, and so that's because I needed to take this and kind of rotate it over. So what I actually did accidentally is I deleted the empty, which was used to parent the lights. So if we just select each light and go to the constraint properties on the target object, we're just going to choose this microphone controller. And then we'll select this light here, we'll do the same thing, parent it to the microphone controller, and the same thing for the last light. So now when I move this around, the lights are going to follow along with it. So now I can move this light in a bit closer if I just want to make the entire scene a little bit brighter. That's looking pretty good. So what I'm first going to do is animate the microphone rotating, and then we're going to rotate this object over so it's sideways. But if I select the main microphone and rotate it, you can see the top isn't moving along with it. So I'll go back to solid view, and what I want to do is select the 3 objects here which are inside. So if I go into wireframe, I'll use the box select and just box select those objects, and then I want to just deselect these other objects. So now we have all those objects selected. We're going to lastly select the microphone, and then let's hit Control P, and we're going to set parent to object keep transform. So now if I move this object, this is going to move the entire microphone, but if I move this microphone, it's going to move the entire thing. But also right down here, we need to parent these objects. So we're going to select these 2 objects. We're going to lastly select the microphone, and again, Control P, object keep transform. So now we can rotate the microphone and animate it. Let's go into the camera view, and let's go into the material preview just so we can see the materials. So I'm first going to rotate the microphone over on the Z-axis, kind of over this way, like that. And then I'm going to hit the K button add location, rotation, scale, and that's going to be at the starting frame. Now let's change the end frame. So I'm going to make the end frame 120. It's just going to be a shorter animation, just 120 frames long. So I'm now going to go here to the very end. I'll go to 121, which is one after the end frame, and I'll just rotate this over kind of to about that. Hit K, location, rotation, scale. And now if I play this, it's just rotating. Let's select everything in the timeline and we'll hit T, and we're going to use the linear interpolation so that it's moving at a consistent speed. So now what we can do is select this object here, and we can just rotate this so that the microphone is rotated by about 45 degrees. And you could also rotate this around on the Z axis if you want to, the local Z. If you want to change kind of that pivot, just kind of rotate that over. I might rotate it over just a little bit. So now as it's rotating, you can see the logo blend sound. So now I just want to animate the camera because I want the camera to slowly move in. So we're going to go to the starting frame, hit K, location, rotation, scale. We can go to the very end, and then we'll hit G and double tap Z and just bring the camera in just like that. And then again, K, location, rotation, scale, and then select the keyframes, and we'll hit the T key and use linear interpolation. So now the camera just slowly zooms in. Now as far as the focus, I want the focus to be blurred, and then it's going to move towards the object. So what we're going to do is go to the starting frame, and I'm going to move the focus kind of over here farther away from the microphone. So if you go into the rendered viewport mode, you can see the microphone's nice and blurred. So we'll add a location, rotation, scale there for the focus. Now I'm going to move over to frame 35, so 35, and I'll move it really close to the microphone. We're just going to place it here on the surface of the microphone, and then hit K, location, rotation, scale. So now if I just go into the rendered viewport mode and play this, you can see at the very starting it comes into focus and it reveals the microphone, and then you can see the logo. And so that is it. The animation is already finished. That was a pretty easy animation to do. So let's save this project. So let's render all of these into a folder. So we've already set up all the render settings in the previous blend file. So we copy this file so it has the same settings. But we do want to go right down here to the output properties, and we want to set a different folder for the other frames. So we'll click on the icon. And here in my project files, I'll click here to add a new folder. This one I'm going to call frames 2, and we'll go into this folder and click on the accept button. So just make sure everything's set up, make sure you're using the right samples, make sure the compositing has the denoise so everything's set up. So I'll just save the file again, and then we can just click on render and render animation. So all the frames have rendered, so I've just opened up a brand new Blender file, and I'm going to click here on video editing. If you don't see this, you can click on the plus to add a new workspace, and you can just add new video editing. So here in the sequencer, I'll go to the add menu, and let's add image and sequence. And I'll locate to the folder with the first frame. So we'll just select everything by hitting the A key and add image strip. And then with this strip selected, we're going to click on strip, and then we're going to choose set render size. And now it's playing with the correct render size. So let's now add the other strip. So we'll hit Shift A and add image and sequence. And I'm going to go into the folder with the other frames. We'll hit the A key to select everything and add image strip. Let's just bring this over here. So now when I play this, you have the first shot, and then we have the second shot. And then for the end frame, let's drag this way over here to the end. And I need to set the end frame to 570. So then of course you could add lots of other things like sound effects and music. You could also add like text here by going to the add menu here and adding text. I added text in the little corner of the video, and you could have the animation fade in and fade out, but let's now just render it to a final video. So let's scroll right down here, and we need to set an output. I'm just going to choose it as my desktop, and I'll just save it as like video. Just save it there as video on my desktop. Here in the file format, I'm going to change this to FFmpeg video. And then if you open up the encoding here, I'm going to be using MPEG-4 as the container. I'll use the video codec of H.264, and I'll use medium quality and good. And then also if you have any audio, you can set the audio here. I set the audio codec to AAC. So then you can save the file if you want to save this video editing file, and then you can just click on render and render the final animation. And so that's going to finish up this entire tutorial series. So that's how you create this studio microphone product visualization animation in Blender. So thank you so much for watching the entire tutorial series. I hope you learned a lot from the tutorial series, and I hope you enjoyed following along. And if you're enjoying my Blender tutorials and you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, a great way to do that is by joining my Patreon page. So if you join one of my Patreon memberships, you'll be helping to support the channel each month, and you'll get access to lots of Blender content. And you can get access to the same Blender content on my Gumroad store, so if you'd just like to make a one-time purchase of one of my products, my Gumroad store is a great place to do that. And on my Gumroad store is also the finished project files, so if you're interested in purchasing the finished project files to go into the Blender file to use as study material or just to use the 3D model in your projects, you can find the links of that in the description. So thank you everyone so much for your support. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial series, and thank you for watching.